February morning meeting. And as you can tell, we are recording this session. And this is about the 2020 census results in Minnesota. And I'm Colleen Feige, the president of the League of Women Voters Edina. And it's my pleasure to welcome Susan Brower, who is the Minnesota State Demographer, celebrating her 10-year anniversary this month. Congratulations, 10 years. Did you replace Hazel Reinhardt?
So Tom Gillespie was the demographer who was in that spot for many years, okay. In between Hazel and I. Yep.
Okay. Well, and Susan is going to talk with us about the results of the 2020 census, which, as everyone is aware, got delayed with the pandemic and so on, and some of the reports got delayed, but she's going to give us the latest information. There are many people on this call that were part of the Complete Count Committee in Edina and maybe in other places as well. So we welcome all of you. And if you are not, we're just curious who is attending. If you're not a League of Women Voters member, if you could just put in the chat what, if you're with a league or just a community member, that'd be great for us to know that we're reaching some other folks. So just put that in the chat. And Susan is willing to take questions as she speaks. And if you want, you can also put them in the chat, and Julie Rogers-Bascom will be monitoring that. So Susan, thank you very much for joining us, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I will say, you know, the material that I've prepared today really talks about what we know from the 2020 census, how it went, and what we know from the 2020 census so far for the state overall. And I focus in on the city of Edina as well. And so I will just add that, you know, I grew up in Southwest Minneapolis, which was, you know, right bordering on Edina. So I feel like many of your communities is kind of my home community as well, where I went to church and did my shopping and all my activities and so forth. I feel like it's very much a part of who I am and how I grew up. So thank you for having me back to talk about these results. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so I don't have to kind of gesture out what I'm talking about. I can just show you. All right. I will just say for those of you that may not be familiar with our office, we're a small office, just 4 people. That is part of the Department of Administration, part of state government. We ballooned to about 10 people during the census because we did census outreach, but we're back down to our regular complement of 3 demographers and a program person. So we are small, but we do a lot of talks like this one today. We tell people about data and about how the state is changing and what it means to a number of different groups, whether they're involved from a civic participation point of view, whether they're involved because of their business, a nonprofit, or, you know, any kind of any level of government. That's kind of what we do, and so I'm happy to share this information with you today. So the 2020 census was unlike any other census, of course, with the pandemic hitting really at about the same time that census takers were set to go out in the field and do their follow-up, just about the time when those census forms were hitting the mailboxes. That's when the pandemic really started impacting our lives. We had been expecting that response rates would be declining over time because that's just what was happening with surveys generally. That's what the Census Bureau predicted, and what we knew we were up against is that we expected to see a lower response to the 2020 census than past censuses, just because of those reasons. People are tired of census. People are tired of surveys. They're tired of answering questions. They're tired in many cases of the government. And so this is just kind of the challenge that the census took place, or the context in which the census took place. But what we found in Minnesota and in many parts around the US, but not everywhere, was that response rates actually increased in many areas. You can see that Minnesota's response rate increased by a percentage point. Minneapolis and St. Paul, both their rates increased, which, you know, those areas can be more difficult to count for a number of reasons. And even Edina, 80 to 83%, you know, we saw an increase in those response rates as well. And so, you know, this is great news for us. We want those response rates to be high. I will say when we say these self-response rates, when we report them, these aren't the number of people or the percentage of people that answered the census period. This is the percentage of people who answered the census without additional follow-up from a census taker, or without having to have their answers filled in by a proxy respondent, meaning like a neighbor or a mail carrier or someone like that. These are people who filled out their forms, went online and filled out their censuses without additional follow-up. And the reason why we care about this number is because when people are responding on their own without having the information pulled from them or cajoled or gotten from a neighbor, we know that the responses are more accurate, they're more thorough, and so this really does bode well for more accurate, more complete data, better coverage across the board. And so this is fantastic that those rates went up. Minnesota tends to have higher rates than the rest of the nation, so it's no surprise that we were above the nation in self-response, but we actually came in first in self-response of all states in the US. And so that was a big accomplishment that is certainly due in large part to all the groups that were involved, the League of Women Voters chapters across the state organization, League of Women Voters, many complete count committees in cities and counties across the state were involved, and that hard work really did pay off. And so I'm really grateful for all that work. We can look census tract by census tract at the rate of self-response. So I was giving you kind of the city and state and US numbers overall. We can look at those self-response rates by census tract, and maybe some of you were following this if you were geeking out like I was during the census and following this in live time. And you can see that the rate of response in Edina is very high. You can see kind of the band that would have the darkest rate, over 85% responding on their own without additional follow-up. And just, I'm giving you kind of the surrounding communities to give you a sense of what those rates look like in different parts of Minneapolis and different parts of the surrounding communities, Richfield, for example. Minneapolis, particularly in kind of the southern part of the city and northern part of the city, had slightly lower self-response, but the area where we saw the lowest self-response, and this is true across many different campuses, is areas around University of Minnesota or state colleges and universities. It's tough to get college students to respond to the census generally, so we expect those rates to be lower. But this time was particularly hard because students were just being sent home from their regular classes at the time that we would have had census takers go out and go door to door in areas that were known to be filled with college students. So there's a specific, what's called an operation, where census takers go out early before students leave for the summer break. But that didn't happen this time around in 2020 because the pandemic delayed that so much and students were sent home so early. Many of them had moved back in with parents or back to a permanent address and did not get the communication about how and when they were to have responded to the census. So that that's one thing that we're watching about, you know, across the state, we're seeing this, you know, whether it's Winona State, whether it's St. Cloud State, around the University of Minnesota. It's mostly the off-campus areas that we're concerned about because most of the students who live in dorms on campus are counted through an administrative process where their school is reporting them living on campus. So less of an issue in places like Northfield, where most of the students are living on campus, but certainly could be an issue there as well for off-campus housing. I'll share one more bit of information about how we responded to the census, and then I'll get to what the data say. This map is showing you where we saw increases in the response rate comparing 2020 to 2010. And you can see that for most of Edina, those rates increased over time because they're showing green, but there actually was an increase, either staying stable or above the rate that was reported in 2010. The central part of Edina saw a slight decline. You know, that's generally what we would expect, given a lot of the challenges that we saw. And so I think overall you can see that this is really a good outcome for the suburbs around Edina, including Edina. Minneapolis less so, where we see those drops in rates, especially, as I said, around the University of Minnesota. Okay, so what did we find out? Well, of course, the big top line news item was that we saved all 8 of Minnesota's congressional seats. We did so by 26 people counted. I know that there are people on this call that were responsible for 26 more people counted. So yes, so thank you for all of your hard work. Absolutely, you can feel personally responsible. Those of you who I know were door knocking, who had campaigns in your communities, who were getting the word out. 26 people counted. That's a handful of households. I mean, it's insanely close. And so that was kind of a wonderful way to end a grueling census cycle. But again, even if you had nothing to do with doing outreach and you just filled out your census form yourself, you can claim responsibility as well. We'll take that too. What we learned is that Minnesota's population grew to 5.7 million. Minnesota does pretty well in terms of growth, and we continued to grow fairly well this last decade. Especially when you compare us to our Midwestern neighbors. So if you look, for example, at peer states like Wisconsin, which is comparable to us in size, Minnesota grew by 7.6% over the course of the decade. That's about 400,000 people. Wisconsin grew about half as much as that. Michigan grew by just 2%, and Illinois actually lost population. You can see North and South Dakota outpaced us. Absolutely true, both had strong economies, but they're also very, very small states. And so to get to those 8.9 and 15.8 percentage points, or percentage change, we're talking about, you know, tens of thousands of additional people over the course of the decade rather than hundreds of thousands. So a very different scale in terms of North and South Dakota. All states, the US in general, in total, and Minnesota grew slower this decade than we did in past decades, and that is due to population aging. I'm happy to talk more about that, but in general, it gets harder and harder to grow quickly when you have an aging population, when you have more people who are in the higher mortality age groups, they're not having children, and you have fewer people in those parenting ages. It's just what happens when you have older communities and older states and older countries. So that's beginning to show up in our growth rates. Again, Where we saw growth, like in past decades, was in the large southern states, Florida, Texas, and in the southwestern states that you can see in the dark green there as well. That's been part of migration trends to the south and the southwest that have been in place for many decades. They continued through to this decade as well. Some of the information that we got from the 2020 census so far, and we only have the redistricting file, so we'll have more coming this year in 2022. But right now, what we have are these top level numbers about the total population in each of these areas and the race of the people. We have a little bit more, we have a little bit on occupancy, but in general, we have not a lot of demographic characteristics, not a lot of detail around age yet. That will be coming more this year. For now, these are the basic kind of data points that we have. Only what's needed for the redistricting process has been released so far. So this is the statewide numbers of what we've seen in what we see in 2020 compared to 2010. And as I mentioned, the population grew by about 400,000. It was 402,000 people that were added between 2020 and 2010. The white non-Hispanic population began to decline. You can see that here, 51,000 fewer. Oops, let me see if I can get my cursor to go. 51,000 fewer people who are white non-Hispanic in this census compared to 2010. And every other major race group grew. So the growth that we did see was really propelled by BIPOC groups, or Black, Indigenous, people of color. And you can see in particular, we really had strong growth across the major race groups. Asian or Pacific Islanders grew by about 85,000, Black or African American, which includes both US born African Americans and African immigrants, grew by about 124,000. And then Hispanic or Latino by about 95,000. The American Indian population, Native or Indigenous people, stayed about the same. It doesn't have that group doesn't have the same advantage of international immigration that other groups do. So those numbers tend to stay stable decade to decade. What did grow this time considerably, and this is across the US, is the number of people who reported that they were more than one race. You can see that's the kind of leading growth group, is people reporting more than one race. And in part, we are seeing that at younger ages as we see more interracial marriages and partnerships. So that's kind of part of that undoing of norms that were in place in past decades, continuing into this decade. But it's also because the census this time around made it easier for people to report that they were more than one race. You had more places where you could fill in the races that you identified with, or the cultural groups that you identified with. And so both those things together, both the true change that is underlying this and also the ability to report that change, really propelled those numbers upward. And so that's something that we're seeing in Minnesota and that we're seeing across the US as well. Now, these numbers are from before the census, but since we're on the topic of race and ethnicity, I just wanted to give you a sense of the landscape of where people are distributed by different race groups, BIPOC race groups in particular. And we're looking here at American Indians or Native Indigenous populations in Minnesota. You can see a concentration in the Twin Cities of urban Native or Indigenous people, and then across the northern part of the state where we have a number of reservations. And so both those things kind of produce this distribution of folks. You can see here that we are looking at, I'm hiding my scale and I haven't seen this one for a while. Maybe someone, let me see. Okay, just looking at it, I can't read it, but it looks to me like it's the Black or African American. Can someone read the top? I have something blocking it. Am I right? It says black on top.
It's Asian.
Okay, Asian. Okay, thank you. I'd forgotten my key code and it's hidden by my. So you can see with the Asian population completely mostly concentrated in the Twin Cities metropolitan area here. Then we have, you know, a little area around Rochester, around St. Cloud. This is the Fargo-Moorhead area, largely urban phenomenon, a metro phenomenon of where Asian people in Minnesota live. Here we have Black or African American. And I think what's interesting here is that you see a little bit more of a higher concentration in the St. Cloud area. Many of those are newer Americans. The Somali population is growing there. But also if you just look at the Twin Cities compared to the Asian population here, you can see slightly more concentration in the northern suburbs compared to the Asian population, where you see it more concentrated in the western suburbs of the Twin Cities. So different distributions based on, you know, these different groups where they've settled around the state. And then for the Hispanic or Latino population, also very concentrated in the Twin Cities and in the metropolitan areas, but really much more spread across the southern part of the state, where we have jobs in agriculture. And so we see the Latino population in the state really settled in many of our smaller towns in the southern part of the state. So those differences, you know, are showing up in our census. Here we have just the white population overall, which kind of mirrors, because we are largely white non-Hispanic, mirrors the distribution of people across the state generally. Now I want to talk about what parts of the state are growing. Actually, before I do that, I'll check in with, I think Julie, did you say you were monitoring? Do we have any questions?
There are no
Okay.
questions in the chat. Hope,
Okay.
did you have a question? Because I see
No.
you. Okay.
Oh, no, thank you.
Yep, I'm happy to take those in the chat if anyone has a question about what I'm saying. And I'm happy to take questions at the end too. There'll be time for more discussion and more in-depth investigation of some of these things. So looking at the state of Minnesota, county by county, there are 87 counties in Minnesota. The blue areas on this map are showing you areas of the state that grew, and the darkest blue are showing you areas that grew the most. And so in percentage terms, you know, the Twin Cities absolutely grew the most, especially the kind of southwest suburbs of Carver, suburban counties of Carver and Scott County. Also growth in Olmsted, mostly concentrated or completely concentrated in the city of Rochester. And then again, this darker blue up near the Fargo-Moorhead area, the Moorhead side of that metropolitan area. Growth was really a metro phenomenon this decade. It's been that way for many decades, but growth in metro areas really did pick up more so than in the past. The orange areas of the state are the more rural areas of the state for the most part. And those are the areas that declined in population. Where we see very dark orange colors, those tend to be the more rural, most remote part of the state. St. Louis County, where Duluth is, stayed just about the same. And so Duluth was a metro that kind of didn't see the same level of growth that other areas, other metro areas saw. So I would say each of our metros across the state, whether it's Mankato, Moorhead, Rochester, the Twin Cities, all of those areas saw growth, with probably the exception of Duluth, which stayed pretty stable. And just to give you a sense of kind of how much the Twin Cities outpaced growth elsewhere, each of these bubbles represent the size, the number of people that were added to that county. And 51 counties gained population, 36 lost population, those that gained population are represented in blue here, and those that lost population are represented in red. You can see that those that had enough growth to be labeled with a name and a number are mostly in the Twin Cities metro, although you can see St. Cloud, well, not on this graph. Sometimes in some of my graphics, St. Cloud will pop up a little bit, but mostly it's the Moorhead, Clay County, Olmsted, Wright, which is just above the Twin Cities, which is kind of, you know, just north of the Twin Cities, saw quite a bit of growth as well. Of the 400,000 people that were added to the state, 78% were in just the 7 counties of the Twin Cities metro. So really concentrated growth there. And you can see that just kind of by looking at both of these graphics. In addition to the growth being concentrated really in the Twin Cities, where 78% of the growth happened, the growth was concentrated even more so in the urban core cities. And this hasn't been the case for many decades. Minneapolis and St. Paul, between the last 2 censuses, between 2000 and 2010, both lost population. And now they're leading the state in gains this decade, with 47,000 for Minneapolis, which was the fastest growing city, and 26,000 for St. Paul. Rochester right behind that. You can see that many of our, excuse me, many of our suburban Twin Cities cities make this list as well. Edina added 5,553 people. So this list is largely the big cities in the state and the big suburban cities, particularly those that are on the edges of the Twin Cities that still have land to develop, but not exclusively. We see like Edina, Bloomington growing upward or filling inward rather than kind of growing outward into undeveloped land. And so
if I could just interrupt, Susan, there were a couple of questions that came in, if you want to pause, if that's
Absolutely.
all right for me to throw them out.
Yeah.
One from Terry: were the rural areas losing population to the metro or to North Dakota?
Mostly they were losing population, not just to the Twin Cities metro, not just to one metro, but to other nearby metros. And so that really has been a phenomenon that's continued and that reinforces itself over time. So just as I kind of mentioned with the US growing slower as an aging population, that's true at in our rural areas as well, that they have faced decades of the younger populations moving away. Sometimes they move back when they have children of their own, when they have their own kind of young families. But the overall net result is kind of a slow trickle out of some of these rural areas. And what that does over time is it makes communities that tend to be much older, that are losing population because their residents are passing away rather than moving away. So what I can say generally is the patterns that we see here, if we were to look at an aging map, it would look very, very similar for that reason. Migration continues of young people to metropolitan areas, but I will say kind of generally what we see is people making smaller moves rather than bigger moves. So if someone lives in, you know, southern Minnesota, they may be moving into the Mankato area rather than moving to, say, the Twin Cities, although that happens as well. So it's kind of a lot of movement happening and a little bit hard to kind of get our arms around all those trends, but those are some of the high level ones.
And were you looking at Carolyn Jackson's question there, or would?
I don't see
okay.
it.
When the Met Council anticipates 900,000 more people in the metro, what is the time frame for that, and how much of that growth has already happened?
You know, I don't have their, I'm familiar with the person who makes their projections and I followed them over time, but I don't have that information in my head enough to know what the projection window is for 900,000. I can tell you right now that the history that Met Council has had over time has been to down revise its projections as we move forward, and we're not realizing the amount of growth that we've seen in the past. We've actually seen kind of those downward revisions. And so I don't know if that 900,000 is something that we've already moved into the window of, or whether it's something that we'll see a downward revision of. We've seen a tremendous amount of growth in the Twin Cities, but it is also dampened by lower birth rates, by aging. And so when the Met Council or when we're making population projections for different areas, we need to take into account those big demographic forces in addition to kind of the economic forces that pull people in.
Mm-hmm. And then one last, I think it'll be a quick question. Why no numbers for Carver County? Jean asks, why no numbers for Carver County?
So here why didn't it show up on the bubble map maybe?
Yes.
Oh, I think it was just the size of the labeling tool. It was just the size of the label. So okay. I can certainly point you to those numbers if you're interested, but you know, the point is that it's probably just under, it looks a little bit smaller than Olmsted. So I would put it at about, you know, 17 to 18,000 is probably where it falls, just given the size of the bubble.
Great.
Our programs are so smart, they just decide for us what we label and what we don't. And sometimes we can wrestle with them and sometimes they win. So that's why, yeah. So I want to talk about what's happening specifically closer to home for a lot of you in Edina. For those of you who are not in Edina, all of these numbers are available on our website for other cities as well. I know someone here from is from Bloomington. Those numbers for Bloomington are there as well. But in general, the numbers that we know out of the redistricting file that's been released on the 2020 census is that Edina's population grew to 53,494 over the last decade. You can see that the BIPOC as a kind of a big group of people, many different races included there, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that number grew from about 6,400 in 2010 to about 11,300 in 2020. Edina is one of the cities where the white non-Hispanic population actually grew. That hasn't been the case for many communities, but that population grew there as well. And so in general, what we see here is that much of the growth is attributable to populations of color, but in Edina's case, the white non-Hispanic population grew as well. And that just tells me that there are, you know, a continued influx of younger people with families, perhaps continued growth of pulling people in to replace some of the older folks who are aging in place in the community of Edina. We can look specifically tract by tract at where the growth happens, and I'll just kind of point out, this should be familiar to you, hopefully familiar to you about where this growth would happen, but here on the southeastern edge of the city, we're showing very kind of high proportion of growth. And then along this central western edge as well. We can look tract by tract at the numbers as well, the number of people who are added. And you can see the dot here represents growth compared to this bubble here, which is 2,000 people. So this is, I think, about 1,500 people added to this census tract. On the southeast side, I know there's been a lot of growth around that area. in terms of apartment buildings going up, a lot of new developments. And you can see that less growth happening where there's more single family homes. So not exclusively kind of new buildings that are driving that growth, but for the most part, that's where we see really those 5,000 people added really can be concentrated. You can see that it's really concentrated in areas where there was new development happening. Just to put a finer point on some of this growth, here are your numbers in tabular form. We talked about the white non-Hispanic population growing just a very small amount. The Asian population kind of led growth, but with almost 1,900 people in the last decade. And then again, that multiple race group that I talked about statewide as being one of the numbers. So Edina went from having 13% of its residents identify as people of color or part of a BIPOC community to 21% in 2020. And that's in line with the state overall. It's a little bit less than the state average of about 24%, but very much in line with the changes that we have seen over the last decade. Now, to kind of wrap things up here before we discuss more in questions. I do have quite a bit more, but I have information on how redistricting will be shaped by these numbers. I just want to give you a sense of the different growth patterns that we've seen across political districts, so you have a sense of what is happening with the redistricting process right now at the Capitol and in the courts. I will say that my role in that has been fairly minimal. I have been part of those committees as they have learned how to use the data, what they say, what the general patterns are, but I don't have any involvement in actually drawing any lines. My role is to kind of inform and answer any questions that they might have as they're doing their work. The legislators and the courts, and in some cases, some community groups have been responsible for drawing lines and suggesting lines and so forth. With respect to our congressional districts, the first thing I'll say is that had we lost a congressional seat, this size that we are aiming for, so that all districts are equal, the 713 would have had to have been about 813. So we are pleased, and especially the regions in Greater Minnesota, the congressional districts in Greater Minnesota, people who live there are quite pleased that they won't see their districts stretching across the entire state, even though they are growing as compared to 2010. The district where Edina is located, the 3rd congressional district, grew the most of any district. That may not be a surprise now after I've showed you where all the growth has happened and that it was concentrated in the Twin Cities and the western part in particular, the southwestern part. So the 3rd congressional district led the growth. These 3 districts here, 1, 8, and 7, are largely Greater Minnesota districts. And so as we saw, there was less growth there. And so the redistricting process now is to redraw the boundaries so that all of these districts will equal that ideal size of 713,312 people. And if we look at the Senate districts that are also being redrawn, the House districts are being redrawn, but I can't really show them to you graphically because there's too many of them. I'll just kind of show you the Senate districts across Minnesota. Each of these bars represents the growth or the loss in Senate districts across the state, with District 49, where Edina is located right there in the green, it's highlighted there. You can see that most state Senate districts grew, there were just a very small number that lost population. And many of those that grew the most, we'll look at a map in a moment, were in the Twin Cities in particular, especially in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I showed you those cities grew the most of any city. So these numbers represent how much each of these districts grew, and these bars represent how much these districts will need to change to meet that ideal size. And so I just am sharing this with you to give you a sense of how much each of these districts will need to be kind of redrawn or changed in order to meet that size. And even though some of these districts in the center here may not need to change in population size very much, they may need to change quite a bit to accommodate changes of their neighbors. So it's really a very complicated process to redraw these maps, and it really is remains to be seen just what will be adopted. This is just a spatial representation of those same numbers across the state. You can see it really follows what we saw when we looked at the county level changes, but these are the changes, the differences from the ideal population size of state Senate districts. And for many of our greater Minnesota districts, shown here in the lighter colors of that kind of cream color, that lighter yellow color, those are districts that will need to grow in geographic size to meet the new ideal. With many of our suburbs of the Twin Cities having this dark green color, meaning they'll need to shrink in geographic size to make up the same number of people. You know, Mankato is showing up here. The Mankato area is showing up here in green. The Rochester area, and again, the Clay County Moorhead area is showing up as well. In general, what this likely means is a shift of political power more to our metropolitan areas and away from some of the rural areas where population has been declining, although slowly. And if we zoom in on that same map to kind of look at the Twin Cities metropolitan areas, you can see kind of a closer look at, here we have the outline of Hennepin County and Minneapolis and St. Paul, especially kind of around the warehouse district is where we saw population gains in that area. That area grew so much that we actually expect to see almost a full house district added, not specifically in that area, but the population is there to support it in that area. And so with that is what we know so far from the 2020 census. We will get more information this year that gives us more information about detailed race, about detailed age, information like that. But for now, this is what we have is these population numbers and basic race information. Do you have questions for me? I'll pull up the chat as well.
I'll tell you the most recent one that came in from Hope. Do you have a sense, albeit general at this point, of what these growth numbers mean for housing, especially affordable housing?
So I haven't seen a recent report out of Minnesota Housing that kind of projects demand. So that's where I would look first, but I can tell you generally what I hear from folks and also what I know about where our population is kind of in their life transitions. I'll just say, first of all, everywhere I go, I'm hearing that housing is in short supply. It is a metro phenomenon. It is a rural phenomenon, small town, large town, across the state. Housing that's affordable is something that I hear. Employers are saying that, you know, especially in many of our small towns, employers are saying, I need more workers. There's nowhere in this city for them to live. There's nowhere nearby for them to live. We can't support population growth here because we just don't have the housing. Part of what I believe to be happening is that we are at this point where the largest generation in our state, the baby boom generation, some have begun to move out of their housing into smaller housing to downsize. That is, you know, one pattern that happens fairly predominantly, but not all. Many of our baby boomers are still young. Age 58 to 76 is the age of that generation right now. And so, you know, there are many people who are still in housing that may be maybe larger than what they need, and may kind of have certain implications for demand, that the housing that may become available in the coming years as the baby boomers make those transitions has not yet fully become available. So I think we're at a point right now in particular, just because of where baby boomers are, where it's particularly painful. But with respect to kind of just how much housing there is at what level, I would look to Minnesota housing for those projections. It's just not something I have in my head right now.
Thank you, Susan. I think Arnie has a question. He's got
Yeah.
You know, and maybe as much an observation as a question, I think from many of us who are focused on affordable housing, it's really a crisis for the state and crisis for the country. And it's just begging for a solution. And I don't think we've arrived at it yet in a way that's going to address it to the extent it needs to be addressed. And I think we're fortunate to have several affordable housing projects now underway in Edina. And that's just a good thing. I think thanks to Carolyn and the rest of the city council members that they're responding to that and continuing to try to find ways where Edina can do that in what otherwise is a pretty affluent community and where prices are high. So we'll just need to keep chipping away at that, and for the rest of the state also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Arnie. Thank you. There was another request. Can you repeat the sizes of population for both House and Senate districts?
Sure. I can pull those up for you too. So for the state Senate districts, it's 85,172 is what it will need to be in 2020. And then since the House district is half of that, just divide by 2 for the House district.
Okay, thank you.
And then for the congressional, I don't know if you're interested, the congressional one, since I have it up, I can do that as well. So that's the US House of Representatives, the seats in Minnesota will, or the districts in Minnesota will be 713,312 each, or you know, somewhere, usually it's within 1 or 2 people of that number.
Another question just came in. Could you give us a sense of the age makeup in population growth and loss?
So the numbers that we got out of the 2020 census so far, we only, in terms of age, we only have above 18 or below 18, and that's needed for Voting Rights Act guidelines for redistricting. So I can't look specifically at the last decade and tell you what that growth and loss was, but I can tell you generally that each year, the state grows by somewhere around 70,000 people because of births. And deaths tend to be around 45,000. And then the rest is migration. So typically the state is growing by about 35 to 40,000 people a year, with a very small amount of that, if 10,000 being because of international or domestic migration. So what that means for the age makeup of growth and loss is still, our growth is being fueled by births, so very young, and by migration. The loss tends to be due to the large number of births, less so to out-migration.
Another question, how does the census estimate the census undercount?
I love this question. It's a nerdy question, and so it's close to my heart. I love it. A good question. So there's two different ways that they estimate an undercount. One is by doing something called demographic analysis, which is very similar to what I was just kind of walking you through. They take the number of births and the number of deaths and an estimate of migration. And then they compare that to the census count that they got. So they know, like, generally we have records of births, we have records of deaths. That stuff's not hard to find. Migration's a little bit harder to find, but not terribly. And so that's one way that they estimate how good the count is just by comparing it to the number of people that should be there based on our administrative records in that way. And then there's a second way that they estimate the undercount, and that's with something called a post-enumeration survey. And that is a survey that goes in depth to sampled areas across the US. It follows up in a great amount of detail to ask households again, how many people were living there on April 1st, 2020. And so that's a survey that has already been in the field. We don't have the results from that yet, but that's really when you hear estimates of net undercount or net overcount, that's really where those numbers come from. That survey that does more follow-up than the original census, and then comes up with an estimate of the difference. That's also what gives us the information about differential undercounts, which means, was one age group or one race group particularly undercounted this time around. And we don't have those results. We have the demographic analysis results back, but we don't have the post-enumeration survey yet.
Any other thoughts or questions or ponderings? Kathy just posted a question here. When will you get the rest of the results?
So for the post-enumeration survey, I believe that releases later this year. As far as the additional survey, additional census data that gives more detailed race and age, we don't have a release date yet, but they've been saying summer to fall of 2022 is kind of what we're expecting, but we don't have an exact release date for that. The redistricting data, it's written into law when they have to release it by, and they actually missed those deadlines because of COVID, but there's no deadline written into the rest of the data that's coming. So it's a little bit open-ended.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
This is Jean Tracy, and I have a question. Early on in your slides, there was a slide about the response rate to the census. And our neighbors in adjacent Richfield, there was an area right on our border that was, the response rate was especially low. Any idea why that might be?
I would need, I'm not exactly sure which one that is, but I would first want to make sure that it's not, there's this little sliver right by the airport that it's its own census tract that has, it wasn't there. It wasn't there.
It's right on our border.
Oh, right on your border.
I
Okay.
think it's probably over by where the Y is, right off of York.
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say is that we would expect certain areas to have lower response rates just based on the characteristics of the population there. So whether if there was more rental housing, more apartment buildings, we tend to see lower rates there. We tend to see lower rates if there are people with language barriers. We tend to see lower rates if there are young people who are more mobile. Maybe they're not kind of checking their mailboxes in the same way that older folks are. Those are the things that tend to correlate with lower response rates. And so I would look to those things, although I'm not exactly, I haven't looked specifically at that tract that you're referring to. So I can't say for sure what I would pinpoint to that particular area. But those are the things that we tend to look at when we look at lower response rates.
Hi,
Another,
this is Catherine Dorr here in Minneapolis. With the Hmong people from Southeast Asia in the 1980s and afterwards, we saw a lot of secondary migration. Did any of the census data address that question? Because I know with the Hmong people, many came from California or other states to Minnesota to live with relatives or nearby relatives. So the census data showing huge population gains now among certain ethnic groups. Was any of that type of questions asked in the census this time?
So, yeah, thanks for that question. So it's not asked directly in the census, but we can kind of back up the numbers that we get to see if we think any of that, excuse me, secondary migration is happening. Again, we can compare it like with demographic analysis to see how different our birth rates and our kind of racial composition of the state would be if we just look at births and deaths, and the rest of the growth that, or the change that we have is attributable to migration. So we can expect that if it's not international immigration, that it's migration from other places in the US. But a more, so essentially with the census, we would back up those kind of answers by saying, okay, take out everyone who was born, take out everyone who died, and then who's left. These would be the people who migrated either here or away, and then we can kind of come up with an answer by deducing that. A much more direct way of doing that, though, is with a survey called the American Community Survey that the Census Bureau conducts on an ongoing basis across the US, including in Minnesota. And while it is a sample, and so it's not a perfectly clear picture, it can give us a sense of some of that secondary migration. And so that would be where I would look. We being the state of Minnesota, always have some of that secondary migration as part of the mix. But in general, our domestic migration numbers have been such that we tend to lose more people than we gain from other states. That's kind of the high level picture.
a question about COVID. How do you think COVID has impacted the redistricting numbers?
So I think when we look across the state, the areas that I'm really most concerned about are those colleges and universities, those areas that have student populations living off campus. I think that's where we are likely to, that's where the kind of biggest surprises of the census data stand out. And when I say surprises, I don't mean that I'm not that I'm taking the numbers at face value. It means I'm suspicious of the numbers because we wouldn't expect to see drops in population to the level that we've seen around some of these colleges and universities. So I would say that, you know, redistricting is based on the number of people counted, not necessarily the number of people who are truly living there at the time. And just because of what we know, what happened with the pandemic with college students, it would be in those areas like around the University of Minnesota, like Winona State, St. Cloud State, you know, across different student populations. That's where I'd be most concerned about the impact of the count on the impact of the pandemic on the count and then on redistricting.
A question about data analysis. Improvements in census data analysis combined with other data analysis has raised privacy concerns. What changes in the 2020 census provide more privacy protection? Terry said that he saw that the 1950 census data was just released in detail, the 70-year rule.
Yeah, so this time around, the Census Bureau has released the data. They've protected the data with something called differential privacy. The Census Bureau has an obligation to make sure that no one can be identified in the statistics that are released. And so they have always changed the data just a little bit to make sure that no one can be uniquely identified. However, what they have done this time around with differential privacy has really changed the numbers more than they've changed them in the past. And so even when I was sharing with you, I'll go back, even when I was sharing with you some of Edina's numbers at the tract level, I want to pull it up and show you while I'm talking about it, if you'll indulge me here. You can see these tiny little green dots here. You can see these tiny little red dots. Some of these numbers are so small, they're 20 or 30 people counted in the tract. And the method of differential privacy that was added this time to protect confidentiality of respondents has changed the data enough at these very small levels of geography that we can't say for certain whether that is really a true loss of 20 people or a true gain of 20 people. So when legislators are doing redistricting, when planners are looking at these data, they have a much fuzzier picture than they used to have in the past. It's all for a good purpose, but it is somewhat concerning for those of us who use the data and rely on the data for a really clear picture at least once every decade. And that's just because we can't say with a great deal of certainty whether that number 30 is truly 30 or whether that loss of 20 is truly a loss of 20. And that may not matter for some purposes. It may not matter if we're trying to generally get a sense of where the growth is. But for other purposes where you need more precision, where you need to understand, for example, rates of cancer incidence or different rates of any number of factors that you make a rate off of the population count, it really can be troublesome. As you add these smaller geographies together, they tend to be more accurate. That's what differential privacy does at the higher levels of geography. So it's less of a concern when you're looking at the city as a whole, but when you're looking tract by tract and really need that precision at a low level, that's where many of us have shared our concerns with the Census Bureau about those privacy protections. all of us get why you have to protect privacy. That is not the issue here. It's really important, especially when you're trying to gain the trust of folks to fill out their census form come next time. I know those of you that worked on the census this time, that you said this, you told people your answers are protected. No one will know what your answer was. This is just for statistics. And so I know the Census Bureau has to protect these numbers, but what we're seeing in some of the numbers for some cities, for some areas, is not the precision that we would hope to see.
You had mentioned, yeah,
Catherine
go ahead,
Dor-
Catherine.
Oh, Catherine Dorr here again. Was there any analysis of the data to find out how many languages were spoken and hopefully the distribution of those? Because I'm thinking this gets to local, county, and state resources that are needed for our schools and social services.
Yeah, so again, that information comes from the American Community Survey, which the Census Bureau conducts on an ongoing basis. And that's something I'm happy to point you to. What I found in terms of languages and really understanding how our communities are changing is that I tend to look both at the American Community Survey data in addition to just schools data on their student population, because that doesn't come from a sample. And so we have much more, a much clearer sense, at least for the student population in any given city, how many people are speaking languages other than English at home. So those are the two main sources. And the language data from the American Community Survey I use on a regular basis to talk about how our state is changing. And it was also part of the Voter Rights Act information that just came out that requires certain areas within the state to provide additional support for people who do not speak English at the polls. There were two areas in Minnesota that were identified. One was in the far southeast part of the state, Houston County, which has some tribal lands on it. So it was identified in that way. And then the other one was in Ramsey County.
Susan, what's the website to get individual city results? It's so exciting that there are other people here from other leagues. And I know that a lot of this are data. Yeah, so if you could tell us, I'll put it in the chat.
Sure. So our website is mn.gov/demography. I can see if I can show you right where to go to.
mn.gov/demography.
Demography, yep, that's our website. And then let's see if I can pull it up quickly. I will do so. Okay, so this is our website, mn.gov/demography. And then on the scrolling feature here, this redistricting data, if you go in there, it gives you all of this is kind of the greatest hits of the data that were released by the Census Bureau for redistricting, but you would want to go into places. That's what the Census Bureau calls cities, is places to look for, say, Bloomington, Edina, that information that I shared with you. So.
Terrific. Any other questions? Just one mention, LWV Edina will be hosting a presentation by Peter Watson on the Minnesota redistricting on Monday, February 28th. If you are a member of the League of Women Voters Edina, we will send out a link to that, a reminder, and a link. If you are a member of other leagues or a community member, go to our website and there's a place to click on and request a Zoom link to be sent to you prior to the presentation. Colleen, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you. And Susan, thank you so much. This was wonderful information. It's just great to have it so boiled down. Thank you very much. And thank you for the work you did with the census under very trying times.
Thank you to you all. I mean, Edina, the League of Women Voters, you all were just amazing.